Any objection to that? No? Okay. Well, in that case, my name is Averil Lerman. I'm a former board member of Alaska Historical Society, past president, and a person working in history. It's my privilege today to serve as moderator for this, the very last session of the 2020 Alaska Historical Society Conference. A conference to remember, a conference for the record books, an astonishing conference after a very challenging year, which I'm sure has been challenging for all of you as well. This conference was only possible because of the near heroic efforts of the conference committee, Rachel Mason, Karen Brewster, and Joe Antonson. And I don't know if there's anybody else's name I should include in that list right now. There are probably others as well, including President Will Schneider and others. Okay. Who?
Bill Schneider.
Okay. I think I just said that, but I'll say it again because it's worth it. Bill Schneider. And also the attendees like you, all of you who are in the audience who I wish I could see, but who have made this conference possible because you were willing to give it a try, which is incredible. If I had a canned applause track, I would play it right now, but you'll just have to imagine it. The topic today is Alaska Canneries. We have 3 excellent presentations by very experienced presenters that I'm looking forward to hearing. I'll give you a little tiny bit about each person, then we'll proceed with the first presenter. The first presenter will be Bob King, who is speaking about the photograph archives of Alaska fisheries scientist Ole
Mathison.
Okay, Ole Mathison. Bob had spent a career working on fishery issues for Senator Mark Begich and Governor Tony Knowles. He's a prominent historian of Alaska fishery issues, especially in connection to Bristol Bay. The second speaker is Anjuli Grantham, also a former president of Alaska Historical Society. Anjuli is now the curator of statewide services at the Alaska State Museum. She is editor of Tin Can Country, Southeast Alaska Historical Salmon Canneries. Sorry, I read that very badly. And a collaborator on the NN Cannery History Project. For those of you who are dying to know what NN means, the important thing here is that NN Cannery is a specific cannery, and that is the name, not a secret that we are being deprived of. She is speaking on new analysis of the Alaska Packer Association's China contracts. Sorry if I bungled the S's on that sentence. The final speaker is Katie Ringsmuth. Katie teaches Alaska history at UAA. She is the founder of the public history business Tundra Vision and oversees the NN Cannery History Project, which is a community effort that's working for the Alaska State Museum to develop the exhibition Mug Up, the Language of Work. The title of her presentation is A Project for the Moment. She's speaking about cannery history and the ways in which it is particularly relevant right now. After the last presentation, there will be 2 brief comments, one from Karen Brewster and closing comments from President Will Schneider. Each speaker we've decided that we'll keep questions and answers till the end of the 3 presentations. Each speaker will speak for 20 or 25 minutes, and then the next presentation will begin. We'll have questions and answers on all 3 presentations afterwards. If you want to ask a question, you can either write your question out on the Q&A under the Q&A tab of your Zoom screen, or you can raise your hand, and when it's question and answer time, Karen Brewster or I will understand that you have a question you want to deliver orally, and Karen will unmute you so you don't have to write it out. You can just say what you have in mind to say as a question. Did I leave anything out, Karen, or anyone else that is a necessary predicate?
Sounds good to me.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, Bob King speaking first.
Okay, let me get the screen up here. And does that look good, Averil?
Yes, sir. It looks
Okay.
great.
Well, let's go. Ole Mathison was one of Alaska's leading fishery scientists. Born in Norway in 1919, he studied zoology at the University of Oslo. During World War II, he was a member of the Norwegian Underground. He came to the United States right after the war and continued his studies at the University of Washington, where his focus was Alaska salmon. He spent most summers in Bristol Bay studying the population dynamics of sockeye salmon. He later earned his PhD in fisheries biology under William F. Thompson, one of the premier fish scientists in the 20th century. He's the guy with the green hat in the middle. And Ole's next to him, although his head is down. Ole later served as a professor at UW's College of Fisheries from 1955 to 1982, teaching and conducting research at the Fisheries Research Institute, or FRI. Along the way, Ole was a visiting scholar at the University of Moscow, a Fulbright scholar in Norway and Malaysia. He participated in numerous scientific expeditions from the Bikini Atoll to the Antarctic. But Alaska salmon was really his main interest. In 1983, he became dean of the UA, University of Alaska School of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences, a post he held for 14 years. His retirement in 1997 capped over 50 years as a fish biologist in Alaska. He died in 2007 at the age of 82. Throughout his career, Ole took photographs of fishermen, boats, scientific work, even penguins. After his wife, Randy, died in 2018, the family kept many of the slides they wanted, but he still had thousands of slides from work. Ole's daughter, Heidi, contacted many of his former students, and 3 boxes of these ended up with me. But they were considerable collection, over 2,000 slides and other material, which I plan to ultimately give to state archives. There is much more to Ole's story, but today's presentation is just a slideshow. And there's so much material, I'm gonna just have to race through a lot of it to fit it in this program. But it's important to show the diversity of material he produced during his career, and you'll be able to view the presentation later on the Historical Society's webpage. Now, dealing with old slides presents problems. I tried to clean dirt and dust off of most of them with a soft brush, but that didn't always work. This is the Nakeen Cannery on the Kvichak from 1947. But I think they actually, if you're interested in doing these, they can be largely saved. Among his earliest pictures is from 1946. This drying salmon at Clark's Point on the Nushagak. A favorite of that is the NN Cannery in South Naknek in 1949. And I'm working with Katie Ringsmuth and Anjuli and other friends on the history of this cannery and the story of the workers who were there. He took many pictures of the cannery over the years. This of the NN in 1979, which documents many of the changes that were either made or not made. And there's still a couple of sailboats on it on the inner finger pier. FRI's Bud Bergner posed in front of one of these boats in 1984. Ole took many pictures of Bristol Bay sailboats, rare for being in living color. many of which were, and the sailboats themselves were used until the early 1950s. This is an NN boat in the Kwijak. These are over on the Nushagak side by the Ekok Bluffs with boats from the Diamond NC, the CRPA cannery in Naknek, and also sailboats in the distance on the Nushagak. He caught the sailboat fishermen at work, pulling their nets on board, peeling fish onto the Tally Scow in 1950. Kwijak set netters who were pitching fish in 1948, discharging the Tally Scow at the NC Clark's Point cannery in 1946. Powerboats were finally allowed in 1951, and here they line up on the Naknek River behind the power scows. This would be in the mid 1950s, and many of the sailboats were converted to power. This in 1956, and used by many of the locals. His photo record of the canneries themselves is really amazing. This is the Warren Cannery in 1978, but it's now burned to the ground. And having a record like this is really valuable for fellow historians. The Red Salmon sailboat, this picture taken during the sailboat days, you can see the yellow hulls there, but it's still operational, even though it burned twice. The Bumblebee Cannery in South Naknek in 1974. The Diamond O closed back in the 30s, but was still used for storage for many years. Now all that's left is the fish house that's closest to the water. The Diamond E in Igigik in 1950. The Peterson Point Cannery along the Kwijak Bay. Another picture of the Nakeen cannery on the Kwijak. It closed in the mid-1960s. One of the last actually Kwijak canneries that survived that long, at least the Kwijak River canneries. Others like the Libby Graveyard Cannery closed during World War II and never reopened, although the location is still used by set netters. The Diamond X and the nearby J closed also during the war, and think the new King Salmon Airport was an attractive incentive for packers to the Naknek River. And it also gave Ole an opportunity to look for fish boxes that were left behind. On the Nushagak side, there's the NC at Clark's Point, the CRPA cannery on Combine Creek. This is a rare picture. This is only the second picture of this cannery that I've ever seen. It closed shortly after the war, but behind it, see the little white dot? Behind it, Queen Cannery moved in. And expanded over the years. At Nushagak Point, there's the last remaining of two canneries. The Whalers Cannery, which closed in 1932, and in Dillingham, the PHJ Cannery, the second cannery ever built in Bristol Bay in 1885. Only the White House, the one farthest to the right, remains, although the other buildings were all torn down and were all torn down, although other companies have built on them. The Peter Pan Cannery looks a lot the same as it does now, except for the boats that are along the dock line, but the facility is pretty much the same. The Togiak Fisheries Cannery served a lot of the local residents there, and hired a lot of people along the first slime line crew jobs. And the Reefer King, one of the first freezer ships in the Bristol Bay in the late 1940s. And you can still see the sailboats that are trailing behind it. Now, their job was, of course, to do research. This is a cabin near Mount Peulic at the east end of the Ugashic Lakes. This was taken in 1946, his first year there. This picture is not dated, but it is near Mount Peulic, where the Demian Hills attracted oil wells that were drilled in the late 1930s. And Ole was able to grab a picture of that. Most of their FRI work was in the Woodtick and Lake Iliamna areas at this Lake Nurka camp. Then just a tent, but they started building it up. This is Ole centering logs to build the Nurka cabin in 1949. And shortly thereafter, they had a substantial cabin. Of note, by the way, is on the left side of the plane, you see what looks like an airplane without wings. That's actually an old snow machine from that area. You can see the skis in yellow beneath it, and it's powered by an aircraft engine propeller in the back. There were other, FRI had other labs on barges. This one at their Aleknagik base camp. They had boats, the RV Iliamna and the Sayak. And that's Randy, Ole's wife, on the top of the Sayak in yellow. Of course, they're taking they're doing work on the salmon, and he took several slides of the fish themselves in the stream as they're running up the creek to spawn. As their workers beach seined, and this was in 1959 to catch the fish. They later tagged and be able to track wherever they went. This was a fyke net catching salmon smolt in the upper Togiak River in 1950, and in the dead of winter too. They also sampled the fish. They measured and weighed them, and I'll get to the goose in a little bit later. They compared they looked at the size of all the fish that they saw. These were actually taken out in the Aleutians in 1963. And these smolts were recovered in Cabin Bay in 1983. All of this information, of course, added to the knowledge of these runs, which was totally lacking, before then, and it became part of the educational material used not just for the Naknek catch, but there are lots of other slides of pictures that were used on the lake. Now, as for that goose, Ole was accompanied on his travels in 1953 by a pet goose, whose name was Pip Pip. And it wasn't just an accompaniment, a person outside. He brought the goose into the cabin and fed them. He actually took a noble portrait of the goose, who was mentioned, by the way, at Ole's funeral. Airplanes were important to get the biologists around. This is a Piper Pacer on floats, Western Alaska Airlines, a Dillingham air taxi. A lot of the planes were pretty common, a Cessna 170 on skis, undated. Some of them were a little more unusual. This landing gear configuration on a Pacer stumped me until I called Oren Siebert of Penn Air, who explained that before the balloon Tundra tires that are used today, they use these tandem tires to operate on soft land. This was in 1953. Even more unique is this Republic CB in Clark's Point in 1947, the year after it was first introduced. There was a lot of military surplus, of course, in the late 40s. This Fairbanks Air C-46 was flying fish off the beach in Igigik in 1980. A Bell 47, a Korean War era MASH helicopter in 1979. And many of you may be familiar with the Reeve Lockheed Electra in 1974. I'm not sure where this, thinking it might be ADAC, but perhaps elsewhere. Togiak had a couple of DC-3s parked near the runway, which actually sort of stretched right into the town. Other villages that Ole looked at were before airports were built in their for them. This is Ekwok up the Nushagak River. The New Savanoski Church, established on South Naknek after the Katmai eruption in 1912. The Kakanok subsistence user in 1947. A New Haven smokehouse owner, Barry Trefon, this picture taken in 1964. This man, I don't know. I can't. He's not identified, and the date is uncertain. But it's a great picture on a cannery front. And this of a Mosquito Point child, taken in 1953. Of course, Ole liked to travel around throughout Alaska, especially when he got the SFOS job. He's visiting the Arctic Ocean in 1969. He went through the Uktiavik Wien terminal back in that day. He snapped photos of Togia, or Cordova rather, in 1957. There's the Juneau downtown picture featuring the courthouse, the Capitol, and the AJ mine off to the right. This is taken in 1959. And the foreground, where you see the Quonset huts, I believe that's where the Department of Fish and Game offices are now today. The Petersburg dock. This is a later picture, I believe. Metlakatla, 1957. He visited a number of, this is the Hollis Clear Cut on Prince of Wales Island in 1957, and look how extensive that was back then. He visited fish trap operations in Southeast Alaska as he was passing through. These some dock trap frames in storage, and this of a brailer moving fish out of a trap in 1952. He took a picture of Kodiak before 1957, before the tsunami made changes there. He was in Anchorage right after the quake in 1964. And this is one of my favorite pictures. It's not about the eagles as much. He actually, in his photographs, liked to use put something in the front, but his subject is really in the back. And if you a few hints as to what it might be. This picture was taken in 1967. That is not an oil well in the background, and it's not on the North Slope. It's actually out in the Aleutians. It was Amchitka Island, where nuclear tests were conducted, including the Milrow 1 megaton blast, which actually took place in '68, but Ole was doing biological assessments out there, both before and after. This is where they stayed, and they had their laboratory in gray to the left. But look at all the Quonset huts that are lining the rest of the island. They did do scientific work out there, trawling for bottom fish and other species in the area. He only came back in 1974 after the 5 megaton Canneries blast, where the government erected a plaque asking visitors please not to take any samples. Well, that's a sort of a real quick run through of the many pictures they have. There, some of them were really striking, and I really enjoyed them. He had a photographic talent that he used all the time. He posed in front of on aircraft carriers as they were taking him to Amchitka. He liked to sunbathe on the snow near the Porcupine Cabin on Lake Iliamna. He took more and more pictures of the NN cannery that you'll hear more about later. He also took photos of the people he met along the way, including this guy who was very lucky. He had 2 very nice king salmon caught near Clark's Point in 1949. And one of my favorite pictures is this, hauling in a cod end behind the research vessel John N. Cobb in 1968, and a great display of birds. And this picture too is one of my earliest favorites. A blurry picture, unfortunately, but it's Ole with a big smile on his face, standing aboard the sailboat he was using for research in 1950. Alaska is now recognized as leaders in sustainable fishery management, in large part due to the contributions of Dr. Ole Mathison and the many students he taught and followed him in their scientific careers. So thank you very much, and let me see if I can get out of this.
Thank you, Bob. That was an amazing display of photographs. It was amazing to see them. We will have questions for Bob at the end when the 3 speakers have each finished. Our next speaker today is Anjuli Grantham. Anjuli, it's all yours.
First, I must unmute, and then I have to share screen. Okay, order of operations here. Okay. Here we are. Oops, nope, wrong one. Sorry, everyone. You share. Okay. I think I got it. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Bob. Those were some fabulous photos and a lovely comparison to what I'm about ready to talk about as well, because while you were looking at this one source of slides, I spent the last bit of time looking at this single source, which are these China contracts that are within the Alaska Packers Association records. And this is a listing from 1892 to 1934. And I'm happy that this conference gave me the opportunity to stare at this source for some more time, because as I'm sure many can understand, sometimes it's like you think, if I stare at a source long enough, will it finally whisper its secrets to me? And while I didn't get too many secrets this time around, I'm excited to share with you some of my findings from this source. So this is the spreadsheet from which I've been working, just a screenshot of some of the data points that I was able to extract from these China contracts. Historians like Chris Friday, Robert Nash, Jack Mason, Donald Gimmery, and economist Lauren Cassidy have written some foundational works that talk about the history of labor contracting as it existed within the salmon industry here in Alaska. And while Robert Nash back in 1975 provided analysis of the totality of the Alaska Packers Association's Chinese contract listings, I thought that it could be revelatory to spend some time pondering the contract listings for just a single cannery. And this is the NN Cannery, the South Naknek, APA South Naknek Cannery. I started this work 2 years ago as I worked with Katie and Bob to write historical context about the NN Cannery landscape and its buildings. And today I'm happy to share with you a bit about this source and hope that this in turn will inspire others to spend time with it and extract other stories relative to coastal communities in Alaska and the broader Pacific world. First, I'm going to talk a bit about the data that these contract listings aggregate. And then I'll share what these listings divulge about 2 topics. Of course, there's a lot more that I could talk about, but today I'm going to talk about what the contract listings share about technology at the APA's Naknek canneries and Mexican salmon cannery crews that were hired by the Chinese labor contractors at South Naknek. Each year, the China contract table appeared within the Alaska Packers Association's history volumes. These are handwritten accounts that annually record the salmon pack per cannery, the president's report to shareholders, the company's vessels, brands, and more. These volumes are all within the large Alaska Packers Association collection held at the Alaska Historical Library here in Juneau. The first China contract listing appears in 1892, and the last is in 1933. In 1936, instead of a contract list, there's a written agreement with the Alaska Cannery Workers Union Local 20195 because the federal government's National Recovery Administration had outlawed the use of labor contractors within the salmon industry due to generations of swindling and abuse. Early on, the Chinese labor contractors were Chinese businessmen who recruited Chinese workers. However, even when Japanese or even white labor contractors worked for the APA, they still were listed under the China or Chinese contract, which was later called the Oriental contract and later called the Cannery Crew List. Not only did the name ascribed to this listing not accurately reflect the ethnicity of all the labor contractors, it also did not accurately reflect the ethnicity of the workforce, as I'll soon discuss. So individual cannery workers were employed by these labor contractors, not the cannery. The labor contractor was hired by the cannery to recruit, feed, manage, and pay the cannery crew. The relationship that's recorded in the annual China contract listing is between the labor contractor and the salmon cannery. The actual contract itself is not included, just pertinent data from and about the contract. So here, as you can see, is the China contract listing from 1894. This is the first year that NN appears. And can you see my cursor? Yes, okay. So it's listed here actually as APC for the Arctic Packing Company. Here, there are only 5 categories of data that are recorded, but by 1930, there were 28 categories of data that were annually recorded. And while there are a few murmurings from those who worked in the cannery within these listings, most of the shouting really does come from the Alaska Packers Association when you look at this data. The data that the APA collected was data that was useful for the running of their business. And since they were not involved in hiring or managing the cannery workers themselves, they did not keep data on the lives or the concerns of those workers. Their data is about money and to a much lesser extent, the men. So even though the number of data points per year expanded, there were several points that persisted over the years, which I'll share with you now. Here's a representative year, 1908. So each year, of course, there'll be the name of the labor contractor, who is either an individual or a partnership. The cannery is also indicated. Sometimes the name is written out, and always the APA shorthand, which is the diamond, diamond NN, for example, diamond M, diamond O, diamond KS, which was the Larsen Bay Cannery. The number of men whom the labor contractor was responsible for providing is also included every year. The guarantee is included. This is the number of salmon cases that a contractor would be guaranteed to receive payment for, even if it was a poor salmon season. The terms are always included as well. And this stipulates how many cents per case the contractor would receive up to the guaranteed amount, and how many cents per case they would receive for each case over the guaranteed amount. And at the end of the salmon season, the APA would pay the labor contractors based on the number of cases of salmon that the cannery crew had packed, so that's usually recorded, plus any incidentals such as money for making salmon boxes. So the total paid for the cannery crew is included as well for most years. New information is collected as the years progress, including the cannery workers' ethnicity, the salary of key staff that were hired by the labor contractors, and more. And taken as a whole, one can really chart trends and pull out historical events through these listings. But the two findings that I would like to feature today relate to how technology changes manifest within the contract listings, and findings related to the cannery workers' ethnicity. So first I'll talk about the mechanical changes. These listings all come from these bound history books, and these history books recount all sorts of information, but they really never actually mention when there's physical improvements to the plants or when new cannery technologies are adopted. Understanding the development of cannery equipment over time is an essential part to understanding Alaska's salmon industry, including what kind of work was transpiring within the cannery, how the cannery landscape was changing over time, and more. There's one machine in particular that has almost become a character and a folktale in a way, and that's Smith's iron butchering machine, patented with the name the Iron Chink. It was given this name because it was supposed to replace the skilled Chinese salmon butcherers who did the job in the cannery. And one supposedly could correlate the decrease in the number of Chinese cannery hands to the ascendancy of the iron butchering machine. But of course, this simplified explanation ignores the restrictive immigration policies of the US, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, as reasons why fewer Chinese cannery workers were employed over time. But nonetheless, the question is, does the China contract data show that technological innovation reduced the need for cannery workers? Frustratingly, I have been unable to determine when the iron butchering machine actually was first put into place at Naknek. I turned to the China contract data to see if the numbers might point to an obvious answer. And because after all, if the folktale about the iron butchering machine is true, the output of salmon cases would increase as the number employed in processing would decrease. The China contract table includes a metric which is useful for this analysis. It's the number of machines. Here it says machines operated. It's never actually specified what machine is being referred to. It isn't the iron butchering machine, as its invention came after this data point appeared in the annual tabulation. Instead, all of those who are on the call right now, or those who my fellow speakers today, we all agree that they're probably referring to canning lines and the number of canning lines in each of the canneries. So in 1904, NN had 4 machines or canning lines. For the next 10 years, labor contractors hired from 49 to 52 men per canning line. In 1915, that number dropped to 38 men per canning line. So does that mean it was the summer of 1915 when the NN cannery first used the iron butchering machine? Perhaps, but not necessarily. Even if it had been in use then, it was just one arrow in the cannery's new quiver. All indication points to actually another innovation transforming cannery work and leading to hiring fewer men, and that's the sanitary can. So here we have the 1911 Oriental contract, as it was called then. And if you see here at the bottom, NN, there are 2 fees indicated in the terms for how much the labor contractors would receive per case of salmon packed. DS would receive 44 cents per case, and OS would receive 55 cents per case. DS stands for double seam. This would be the sanitary can. OS stands for old style. Old style salmon cans required a longer cooking time, manually venting the cooked cans, and then manually patching the cans with solder. For the old style, each can required the touch of a skilled worker to assure that the contents would not spoil. But for the new DS double seam or sanitary cans, these cans were solderless systems and it eliminated the venting and the patching process. The first year that it was used in Naknek was 1911, where it appeared in the terms category there. And skilled cannery workers received 11 cents more per case for the more labor-intensive old style can. In 1912, it was the same. But by 1913, APA's Naknek Canneries had fully embraced the sanitary can, as there's no longer the two different price schemes. As this American Can Company advertisement from a January 1917 issue of Pacific Fisherman indicates about the old style cans, quote, "The method was slow, laborious, and costly. It was also incompatible with the progress which was being made in other branches of the canning industry," end quote. And I was thrilled to find this ad because I've actually seen the photo on the right many times, never been able to actually date it. And now we know it's from around 1917, as that's when it appeared in Pacific Fishing. And you could see these are cannery workers in the past patching the cans compared to on the left, this new sanitary can line. It's likely that after the APA embraced the sanitary can for its Naknek canneries, the company then installed a whole host of other upgraded machines, potentially including the iron butchering machine. So while it's still unknown when the iron butchering machine was installed, data from the Naknek cannery and these China contracts indicates that it was a variety of technological shifts, I believe, that brought about a decrease in the number of cannery workers that were required to make the salmon pack. And it seems that the sanitary can played an oversized role in these changes. Another finding that is really evident within these China contract listings is the ethnicity data, and that's what first drew me to this source in an attempt to learn more about the life stories of the migrant workers who labored in Alaska's salmon canneries. One thing to note about the numbers that I'm about ready to share with you is that some years the Diamond NN, the Diamond O, and the Diamond M canneries are all reported together, and some years they're reported apart. Katie just mentioned that those canneries, actually all of them, Naknek canneries, shared a superintendent, and many years they also shared a labor contractor. So that's one of the reasons that their numbers are aggregated. As a result, though, it means it's impossible to really have numbers for a specific cannery at this time. 1905 was the first year that the ethnicity of cannery workers was recorded, and it assigned laborers to 3 potential categories: Chinese, Japanese, or miscellaneous. That year, 1905, there were only 2 people who worked under the labor contractor that fit into this miscellaneous category. Yet very quickly, the demographics of the cannery shifted. In 1911, 6 years later, there were 133 workers who were listed under this miscellaneous category. 2 years after that, there were 337 workers at the NN, O, and M canneries classified under this miscellaneous heading. It's clear that recruiting methods had changed, as well as immigration trends, and that these shifts happened at a much quicker pace than the company's data categories were modified. But the question is, from where did these 337 people hail? The next year, we can begin to ascertain this as finally new columns were added to record the Filipino, Mexican, and Puerto Rican cannery workers, in addition to the Chinese, Japanese, miscellaneous cannery workers. In 1914, the first year that they were separately counted, 93 Mexicans labored at the NN cannery, making them the largest single ethnic group that year. This was surprising. As I continued to move forward in time, it became apparent that 1914 was not an anomaly. Taken as a whole, from the first year that ethnic data was recorded in 1904 through the end of the labor contracting system in 1934, a total of 4,339 Mexicans worked at the NN, M, and O canneries, making Mexicans a predominant ethnic group at APA's Naknek plants. Far behind, in second place, were Chinese workers, who numbered 2,515. So almost 2,000 fewer Chinese workers over time than Mexican workers. This analysis of the China contract did demonstrate what we already knew, and that's that Chinese labor contractors hired a multi-ethnic crew and that non-Asians labored under the so-called China contract. However, the astounding preponderance of Mexican laborers at Naknek was really unexpected. While cannery workers overall are mostly quiet sentinels in cannery sources, Mexican cannery workers are all but silent. While much more time needs to be dedicated to uncovering the histories of these Mexican cannery workers, there's one strong indication that's present within the China contract table itself that tells an important story. And that's the name of the labor contractor for the NN Cannery. So here's 1928. And the NN Cannery, oh, where are you? Oh, there's up there. It's Lem Sen. Lem Sen had a business which was Quang Ham Hua and Company. And it's unknown for how long Lem Sen owned Quang Ham Hua and Company, but that company was engaged in labor contracting for the APA from 1892 to 1934. So the entirety of the labor contracting era. Lem Sen is listed as the labor contractor for APA canneries from 1923 to 1935. The California Bureau of Labor instigated a years-long investigation into Lem Sen and Quang Ham Hua and Company's San Francisco-based associates, Young and Meyer Tailoring Company. Lem Sen would recruit Chinese cannery hands for the Alaska Packers Association, and he subcontracted the recruitment of Mexican and Filipino cannery hands to Young and Meyer. Lem Sen did not pay Young and Meyer. Rather, Young and Meyer found a multitude of ways to extract payment from the cannery workers whom they were recruiting. For example, they would require that the new recruits buy exorbitantly priced suits and other sundry items from their San Francisco store on credit and reduce the cannery workers' end of season pay accordingly. After years of fleecing Mexican and Filipino cannery workers, the owners of Young and Meyer were charged with violating California peonage laws and were imprisoned. This also catapulted the demise of the labor contracting system overall. While we know little about those 4,339 Mexican workers who labored at APA's Naknek canneries, we know that most of them were recruited by Young and Meyer, paid virtually nothing for their work, and were stuck at the end of the season with poorly made, expensive suits. Like all sources, these labor contracts require additional materials for developing meaning and context. And like many other sources, these lists obscure as much as they illuminate. Yet these listings are useful for documenting changes within each of the plants, charting demographic shifts, and more, all while reflecting national and international events. This data really is ripe for further analysis, and I encourage others to spend time with this source as we work together to break down the veil that has obscured the stories and voices of Alaska cannery workers. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjuli. That was fabulously interesting. And I'm sure we have questions for you at the end of the last presenter.
Hey,
The last presenter, yeah?
when you're speaking, we're not seeing you, just so you know.
Oh, I wonder why not.
I don't know. We're seeing the reflection of your arm somehow, but just so
Oh, that's helpful. Yeah, I must have moved, or I moved.
and your laptop or something.
Okay, thanks. I didn't notice that, obviously. The camera got reversed.
Yeah, we're seeing your screen. There we go.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that. That was great. And thank you. Thanks, Karen. The last presenter today is Katie Ringsmuth. Katie is speaking on a subject described as Project for the Moment, which sounds like it's something that will relate the issues of today to the issues of the history that she's been working very hard on. Katie teaches history at UAA. She founded the public history business. I think I already told you this before, so I won't repeat it. As great and interesting as it is, and as worthwhile as it is to read it again, I'm looking forward to hearing you, Katie. Go ahead.
All right. Okay, cool. Thanks, Averil. Okay. Oh, let's see. There we go. Okay. All right. Well, I'm pretty lucky, as you guys could tell from the two previous speakers. I am a very lucky person to be able to work with you guys, Bob and Anjuli. It's a pretty beautiful day here in Eagle River, where I'm talking to you guys from. Nice and sunny, a little chilly, but I really hope that wherever you are at right now, that you are healthy and happy too. So, full disclosure, with the recent coronavirus canceling public gatherings, I did not plan on giving a paper this year. But then when Rachel Mason asked me to participate in this virtual conference a couple weeks ago, well, I still didn't have a paper. So what I'm going to do today is share with you guys the NN Project's current activities, and really how history has played a really important role during the COVID era. And Karen Brewster, by the way, is offered to help read some of the questions for me. So anyway, thanks to the short video that many of you guys, I believe, saw during Tim's presentation, that caught the attention of the National Humanities Alliance. And this last summer in July, they invited me to participate in a virtual online briefing called Between Two Bookshelves, Humanities Organizations and the COVID-19 Pandemic. So this webinar was organized specifically for congressional staffers in Washington, D.C. to spotlight how humanities organizations like the Anna Cannery Project are serving communities in crucial ways throughout the COVID-19 crisis, and why it is so important to fund institutions that support history and humanities programs, specifically to encourage Congress really to support additional funding to the NEH under the CARES Act. So I had the honor of representing the NN Cannery Project in this webinar. It was moderated, the conversation was moderated by Cicely Hill, the National Humanities Alliance Director of Community Initiatives in Washington, D.C. And she was the one who described our history endeavors as, quote, a project for the moment. And I thought that I would share the questions she asked me and how I responded.
Please tell us about the NN Cannery and about your work to document its history. What are your goals for the project?
All right, well, the NN Cannery History Project is a grassroots public history endeavor that through the historical lens of work aims to share the oft-forgotten stories of the multitudes of people who canned salmon in Alaska and created an ethnically diverse, economically vital cannery culture. And I have an extraordinary team, as you guys have already seen evidence of. That team consists of historians and policy wonks, artists, curators, filmmakers, and our partners on this project include entities such as the Alaska State Museum, Bristol Bay Heritage Land Trust, the Bristol Bay Borough National Park Service, the Alaska Association for Historic Preservation, and Trident Seafoods, just to name a few. So the Diamond NN Cannery is located, and this is, by the way, one of Oli's photos here, is located on the south side of the Naknek River. This is one of the 5 major river systems that make up the Bristol Bay red salmon commercial fishery. This is, of course, the largest red salmon fishery in the world. The cannery is not the oldest cannery in Alaska, but it processed a lot of salmon from 1890 until 2000 when it closed. And that time period, that span of time provides a historic stage that, you know, tells the entire 20th century. And the cannery didn't burn, nor did its core buildings change purpose. Therefore, the property and its 52 interrelated buildings really tell a story and offer information about the diverse workforce that has been left out of the historic record. And, you know, thanks to Anjuli's talk, that certainly we're trying to tweak out that story. So our goal for this project is pretty simple: to document and to share the underrepresented history of Alaska's forgotten cannery workforce. This is a workforce, again, historically invisible, but nevertheless essential. And that's a word we hear a lot these days. And it's these essential participants in one of the West Coast's most significant 20th century industries. This is an industry that Alan Boris described as representing the Industrial Revolution of the North. And to accomplish this goal, we have worked, by the way, big shout out to the National Park Service and the State Historic Preservation Office to help us nominate the NN Cannery Maritime Historic District to the National Register of Historic Places. We also developed a digital storytelling workshop to give Bristol Bay young people a voice, as well as the confidence in the ability to share their history. And also big shout out to Karen Brewster and the University of Alaska Fairbanks, because they helped us create a digital oral history archive based on cannery workers' social histories. And now this platform can be accessed by researchers anywhere in the world. And right now, we're in the process of producing a museum exhibition with the Alaska State Museum called Mug Up that will open in 2022, hopefully when we're kind of looking back at this time. And of course, this exhibit will share the stories of Alaska's essential cannery people through the workscape. And again, big shout out to Erin Elsmore for this fantastic illustration. Now, I should point out, if I haven't said so like a million times, that this is a collaborative project, and we could not achieve any of this without our partners and collaborators. We have relied on the expertise of cultural resource practitioners, historic architects, filmmakers, archivists, artists, oral historians, curators, incredibly talented exhibit designers, but mostly we have relied on the support of the community itself.
What does the project mean for people who live in Bristol Bay and for those who used to work in the cannery?
So the National Endowment for the Humanities awarded the NN Cannery Project a Creating Humanities Community Grant back in 2017 to revive, reunite, and raise awareness for the multicultural community that has existed in canneries throughout the Pacific Slope for over a century. But rather than attempting to thinly cover all Alaskan canneries, and there are a lot of them, we decided to concentrate on one, the 130-year-old NN Cannery at South Naknek, thereby utilizing one site to tell this vast and deep social history of cannery people, their relationships, and how occupational life has changed over time. Now, the cannery stopped canning, actually putting fish into a can in the year 2000, and it was shut down permanently to all use in 2015 by the current owners, Trident Seafoods. But despite a state of decline, which 130 years, she's still looking pretty good. The NN Cannery is a place that still holds extraordinary community values and history, and therefore creates a conduit for expressing the voices of the cannery people, the local and the global perspectives. Now, perhaps we cannot save the actual buildings, but we can assign dignity to the people who worked within them, from the Filipino slimers, the Chinese butchers, to the native composed spring fall crew. Cannery people's collective knowledge of the mechanical operation, the physical labor, and the salmon themselves formed the cannery's industrial backbone. This was an industry that helped to change the way the world ate, and still they existed in the shadows, only to be marginalized, exotified, and ignored. But now, thanks to our project and community engagement, Bristol Bay youth can be equally proud of a mother who cleans fish as a father who catches them. In many ways, our project aims to validate this work, which has deep ties to the region's cultural and ecological history. So the NN Cannery History Project and the Mug Up exhibit, they're really framed around work. And work is a universal concept that transcends the historically unfamiliar and connects this little known cannery experience to knowledge and values shared by visitors from California or Texas or Kansas. Visitors to this exhibit, Mug Up, you know, they may not know about salmon canneries, but they probably are aware of their essential grocery store workers or meat packers or farm laborers back home. So hopefully the cannery experience can bring dignity to those essential workers too.
I understand that as part of this work, the project commemorated the 100th anniversary of the Spanish flu last year. What did that involve?
Well, yes. The NN Cannery's historic value goes way beyond putting fish into a can. In the spring of 1919, when cannery ships arrived at Bristol Bay, the cannery doctors found people in the village sick and dying, stricken with Spanish influenza. The Bristol Bay outbreak in 1919 was the final manifestation of the pandemic. And in fact, more people died in greater percentages here than any other people in the Americas. The flu buried most of Bristol Bay's adult population, claiming anywhere from 250 to 400 people. The flu left behind an entire generation of children, many of them infants, and we know that this happened because this heartbreaking history was preserved in reports requested by the Alaska Packers president at the time, Henry Fortman. And when crews returned to San Francisco, the superintendents, each of the 3 stations wrote reports as well as the doctors. And thanks to Tim Troll, we also have uncovered photographs that tell the story of what happened to the children, the orphans of the Spanish flu pandemic. And our intent in 2019 was to commemorate a 100-year-old story that many people didn't know anything about, not even Alaskans. Our aim, as Tim put it, was to remember those who died tragically, those who became unlikely healthcare heroes, and those who survived this tragedy to give birth to Bristol Bay's current generation. So in addition to attaching this story of the flu to the National Register nomination and working to tell the story through the Mug Up exhibit, last summer, we produced a photo exhibition that could travel very easily on little small airplanes called Bristol Bay Remembers, the Great Flu of 1919. It was displayed at the Bristol Bay Historical Society Museum in Naknek, at the Alaska Humanities Forum in Anchorage, and is currently at the Bristol Bay Native Corporation headquarters in Anchorage. Tim Troll, director of the Bristol Bay Heritage Land Trust and curator of the exhibit, he also published a book that included firsthand accounts of the flu, including those of the APA reports. And then in October 2019, I really wanted to produce a short film that could be used to commemorate the story via social media. And that was the film that you guys saw during Tim's presentation. And it's also the film that garnered so much attention throughout the nation and even in some cases internationally.
So how has what you uncovered for the commemoration shaped your work over the past few months? What kind of impact is it having more broadly?
Well, what was intended to mark a seemingly forgotten historic event took on new meaning when the recent coronavirus outbreak hit in early 2020. Now, suddenly our stories moved from the realm of history to help inform local communities about the present situation. And since then, we have shared our lessons learned from 1919 with university students, local journalists, the vice president of Trident Seafoods, the largest seafood producer in Alaska, in the nation. And we also shared this story with national and international press seeking historic contextualization. Media outlets such as Time Magazine, National Fisherman, KTOO, KTUU, they requested interviews and historical context that compared the current crisis to the events in 1919. The local CBS affiliate station, KTVA, which I don't even think exists anymore, produced a 30-minute show on its news serial, Frontiers. And then what was interesting is the Korean broadcasting system, their version of NPR, reached out to us for film footage from the film that Tim was in. And they wanted to use it for analysis from a global perspective. And so through this process, it's all in Korean. So I just put in some of the text here, but I was able to develop a nice relationship with the producer, Park, and he shared photographs with his family in Korea. He, like me, has two boys kind of dealing with the social distancing in school. So, you know, it was a way to bond and share an experience that was happening on the other side of the globe. And then most importantly, the local government in Bristol Bay, when deciding on strategies to deal with the current fishing season, the one that was coming up, they cited the 1919 crisis really to underscore their reasoning and the decisions that were being made about social distancing and wearing masks and the procedures with the fishery itself. And so this story that we are working on just the summer before really helped to bring this, the attention to the public. And ultimately, it was the public that really responded well to the policies that were in place. So ultimately, it helped to inform those decisions as well as the community's support for them. I mean, you might just say that history in some ways helped to save lives. So what began as this commemorative effort really ended up helping the current Alaska population to better understand the significance of human resilience and courage. These are characteristics that underpin Alaska's extraordinary people, both then and now.
So final question. We conceived this program considering the COVID-19 pandemic, but we are also aware that it is not the only crisis facing our country. I'm wondering if you could speak to how your project speaks to Black Lives Matter and anti-racist work more broadly.
Oh, yes, so the webinar took place this summer, right at the peak of the protests that were happening nationwide. And, when talking about race and ethnicity, of course, it completely underscores everything we're trying to do with this project. And it goes without saying that much of the 20th century, canneries were segregated, discriminatory, exploitive, and sexist. So for example, mess halls and bunkhouses were segregated by race. Canners referred to their Scandinavian fishermen as white fishermen, while the Italian, Greeks, and Croatian fishermen were called Dagos, who did the same work for less pay. Doctors who treated the young victims of the 1919 flu pandemic reasoned that they survived because, they must have had at least one drop of blood to keep them from succumbing to this disease. And they literally had a machine called the iron sink. And after the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, as Anjuli did a fantastic job of pointing out, Mexicans filled the void until really World War II. And again, as Anjuli pointed out, this is a group that contributed so much to Alaska's economy, and yet are completely forgotten in the historic memory, even in the communities themselves. And women workers, who started working in canneries with the introduction of the egg houses in the 60s and 70s, well, they too were sexually discriminated against and even abused. Now, when the topic of African Americans in canneries came up. Well, in all honesty, I had been focusing very much on these other underrepresented communities and didn't really, you know, when that question was posed to me, I didn't know really how to answer it until I saw this photo that I'd used a lot. But look, this fellow right here, smack in the middle, staring right at me and saying, wait a minute, don't forget me too. So this is a photo from the Diamond J. Conneaut Cannery. This was also an APA cannery. And yes, African Americans too worked in these canneries. And again, with that steady decline of Chinese workers, African Americans were one of the other groups recruited by the Chinese contractors and then the subcontractors to fill the void of the China gang. The first African American cannery workers at the Diamond NN, and again, I know this thanks to Anjuli's work on this. The first ones at the NN were hired under that so-called Oriental contract system in 1920. That year, there were 13 African Americans out of a crew of 530 that labored that year. 6 years later, however, African Americans constituted 20% of the workforce. By late 1920s, we do see that change, and again, thanks to the lawsuits that are going to really put an end to that entrenched hiring practices in canneries. And then you also see the rise of labor unions led by Filipinos that instilled change and ultimately put an end to the corrupt contract system. And as you know, kind of subtly, APA ceases using the Oriental contractor as a hiring classification and replaces it with the label cannery crew. Now, change does not really come for African American workers. They are pushed out of hiring pools by more organized laborers. And the year 1926 marks really the last year that APA is employing African American cannery workers in large numbers in replacement of the Filipino workers. Now, other ways in which African Americans are represented in the cannery story are through markets. Most of the pack at the NN was sent to international markets, but not all. In the early days, canners lacked the technological know-how to deal with defective cans. And in 1900, U.S. Fisheries Inspector Jefferson Moser witnesses this way in which canners really profit from these substandard products. In their do-over cans are frequently sold to brokers without labels or else labeled with the name of some fictitious cannery and find their way into country labor, mining, or Negro districts, or are sent to the South Seas and semi-barbarous localities. So Ross Cohen, he lends some insight into this, and around the turn of the century, the American South, although not a foreign territory, is nevertheless a primary market for Alaska canned salmon. And as Ross has shown through his research, they use really highly racialized imagery of that really designed to kind of harken back to the stage of slavery, illustrating this negative view held by white Southerners, especially during the age of Reconstruction. So what that means is these canners are selling the substandard product to both white and Black consumers targeted in the American South. Now, racialized imagery fades with the civil rights movement in the middle of the 20th century. And as economic power of the African American community grows, salmon canners begin selling canned salmon to housewives, advertised in national magazines like Good Housekeeping and even Ebony magazine. So finally, I just want to say that this has been an extraordinarily personal project. Not only do I get to work with an extraordinary group of friends, which I find, to be pretty lucky. My dad ran the Diamond NA Cannery. He was the last of the APA superintendents, and I too worked there. And it was working with this diverse community that really shaped me, who I am, and even how I approach history and how I teach it to my own classes. And the COVID event, again, very personal. It's not just something I've been researching. My dad, living in Arizona, tested positive for the disease. And so it was really the work that I was doing and the community of people I was working with that helped get through, this time. And so this has been an extraordinary privilege to be able to not only work on this project, but to be able to share this history with visitors from around the world, a history that is literally, saving lives. So, if there's someone you perhaps might want to honor, whether they worked in the fishery or not, consider giving the gift of history for Christmas. And you too would help us share in telling the story. And finally, I just want to dedicate this presentation today to Bev Beaton, who passed away. I had such a great time with Bev in Seattle. I go down there and, she'd have nothing in her refrigerator ever. And so we'd always go out to eat dinner. And she actually told me great stories, Bob, about Ole Mathison when, she was, and that was her connection to the thing I was working on too. And so, and I also want to dedicate it to all the extraordinary female role models in my life, people who are watching, organizing, and participating in this conference right now. And then finally, I want to dedicate, just everything to my dear friend and mentor, Terrence Cole, who, reminded me constantly about the things that really matter in this life. And I'll tell you, 2020, this crazy year, has really made us all remember the things that matter. So thank you all, and thanks to the organizers of this event, and take care, everyone. Be healthy and happy.
Thank you, Katie. That was a phenomenally interesting presentation and a perfect note to finish this marvelous seminar on. We have 15 minutes on, but we can extend a little longer for questions and answers. I'm going to turn this now over to Karen to supervise, although I'll still be here, of course. The only thing I have on my agenda aside from questions and answers is brief comments from Karen about Terrence Cole, probably after the question and answer, and closing comments from President Will Schneider. Thank you all.
Thanks, Averil. Yeah, I'm just going to help kind of monitor the Q&A, and some people have already written some questions in there for you guys. Bob answered some of them already. In terms of questions about Ole's photos, and that I guess those labels, the descriptions you gave, Bob, were ones that he had labeled the photos with. You're muted. Bob, you're muted.
There we go.
There you go.
What was the question again?
Well, it was that you answered it in the Q&A that David Ramser had asked about the labels on the slides, that those were Ole labeled them himself?
Yes, he did. Many of them, not all. Some I just didn't really know, but he put in more information on this. He would put in the year, the month, sometimes the day, and so it was a pretty interesting collection and the like. But it's not complete. And some, though, I could determine by by other pictures or factors in there.
Okay. And Doug had asked about photos of bars, of course, and you answered that. But Doug, I don't know if you saw that Adelaide Herman, I don't know if I'm saying your name correctly, responded that there are pictures at the Bristol Bay Historical Society and Museum in Naknek, and there's a book called Remembering Naknek by Jenny Nelson, who had been a bar owner there. So that was for Doug. And Adelaide also says that they would like to have the next conference in Naknek so we could all see the cannery. So Bristol Bay Chamber of Commerce and Historical Society and the borough are all working together to see if that can be made possible. Katie, Rachel Mason has a question for you. It says, Katie said women started working in cannery egg rooms in the 1960s. Were these all local women, or did any of the imported cannery crews include women?
Hi, Rachel. Well, the whole egg house story is pretty interesting. In fact, the NN Cannery is very likely one of the first canneries in Bristol Bay to have an egg house, and of course that was with where the Japanese processed the egg roe and sent it back to Japan. And it was really starts in Kodiak, right? That's where the first egg houses are, and it's only until the mid 1960s where we see Japan, once the enemy of the United States in World War II, able to market by the 1960s and take that product and sell it back in Japan. So what's interesting about that too is that all of a sudden you have the Japanese really now at the pinnacle of this cannery pecking order because of just how valuable those eggs were to the larger cannery operation. And the NN Cannery really did not utilize local labor to process the eggs. It was almost all women who were brought up mostly from the Seattle area to work in the egg house. And in early 1970s, about 1972, is where they even have a bunkhouse dedicated to just women. So that just indicates the number of women who were included in the cannery workforce. And a lot of that has to do with the egg house. And also the Equal Opportunity Act, which, didn't hurt either because they had to, it was kind of a legal thing too. So anyway.
Yep. And Anjuli, Rachel also asked you whether there were ever any female workers among the China contracts.
I'll say if there were, they were transgendered. That's one thing that's not listed as gender. Ethnicity does come up, but never sex. So I'd say that, there probably were some trans folks that worked in the China crew, but no, as far as I know, women were never explicitly recruited. Have you heard anything different, Katie and Bob, about that?
Well, what's interesting is that the canners themselves write about the Chinese as being the female race. They talk about how they had long hair and long fingers, and they ate like women. So they didn't have to, the food, they didn't eat a lot of food. So, there's kind of I came across just a throwaway line about how they could pay them like women too. So that's interesting that gender, even though, we don't really have any records of female versus male, but just the racialized descriptions of the Chinese were genderfied.
And that kind of brings me to Penelope's question. She asked if I was able to document the actual pay scales among the different ethnic groups. And yes and no. So the cannery contractor received the money, and then the contractor paid the cannery workers. those records are not contained within the China contract listing. It doesn't say how much the cannery workers actually received, it says how much the cannery contractor received. And the cannery contractor, of course, would skim off a whole bunch of money. However, as time moves forward, there are specific pay rates that are included in the China contract for foremen and testers. Moving forward in time, it becomes Chinese foremen and Mexican foremen, and eventually it's first and second foremen. So those individuals were actually called out for their salary within the contract, which in my mind means that they were more assured to get that money from the contractor. And the Mexican foreman and the Mexican second foreman received less than the Chinese foreman and Chinese testers. So there was a different pay scale with the Mexicans receiving less than the Chinese, at least at that upper pay scale. And most likely in the lower too, especially considering that it was, looking at the case of Lerman, the Chinese labor contractor, who he would recruit the Chinese and then subcontract to Meyer and Young, who then, fleeced the Filipino and Mexican cannery workers for everything that they could.
Okay, great. There's a question in the chat from Rebecca Polson. Has there been work on the population of Bristol Bay? Population change? Was there a dramatic loss over the course of the 19th and early 20th century? Why and how communities changed? How canneries fit into the story of Native communities?
Well, that's a lot of questions. But I mean, I guess the short answer is yes. I mean, that's exactly what we're doing. And one of the cool things we're doing, Rebecca, with the Mug Up exhibit is I was able to get grants from the Rasmussen Foundation and the Alaska Humanities Forum to do a 30-minute documentary that looks at the cannery experience from the local resident point of view. And, obviously that includes Native people, but also the multicultural community that exists in the villages in Bristol Bay. So what we're doing is looking at the story of the cannery caretakers. So after the 1919 flu pandemic that killed so many adults in the population, some of them did survive, and the canners in those APA reports talk about how they conscientiously were going to hire the local population to care for the canneries in the off season, in the winter time. And that's exactly what they do. And over time, the local community becomes the cannery caretakers, the wintermen. Their job was to prepare the cannery in the springtime. So when crews arrived from the lower 48, everything would be ready to go. And they also closed everything up in the winter. And so they served as, on that spring fall crew, doing the water, the piping, opening everything up. The laundry women also, the local women in the laundries, provided a very important service to the canneries, so they didn't have to worry about anything other than canning fish. And generation after generation, you see people caring for this cannery. And because I've really focused on this particular cannery, I can say pretty confidently that the fact that this cannery is 130 years old, it never burned down, and it has a cajillion windows that were never broken by any sort of vandalizing or anything like that. I would say that's a pretty good indication of the power and the relationship between the cannery and the local community.
Okay, there was a response in the chat that was only to the panelists, and I'm now putting it to everybody in reference to videos of the Bristol Bay Historical Society. There's a couple more questions, and then I think we'll wrap it up. Bob, you've probably seen this. Ron Inouye says he believes you mentioned Whalers Cannery. Do you know the history of that name?
It was the Pacific Steam Whaling Company out of San Francisco. They started out as going up to the Arctic Ocean and to catch whales, and but by the turn of the 20th century, the whale market was gone, and so they were looking at other economic opportunities, and they picked up several canneries in Bristol Bay and elsewhere. But there are several books written about the Pacific steam whalers that you can find additional background on it. But it was a unique unique cannery. It didn't last long. They were actually bought out by a competitor after just a few years, and the company left. But several people still referred to them as the whalers.
Okay, and this is a question for Bob or Katie. Have you thought of looking at or finding Mitch Kink's information that he's collected about marketing, the Alaska Independent Fishermen's Marketing Association, AIFMA?
Yeah, AIFMA. They've changed their name now to, I think, the Bristol Bay Fishermen's Association. But I knew Mitch very, very well. He was always a great source. But I know the other AIFMA leaders, back then, and they were always very good sources.
Okay. Did you have something, Katie?
Well, I was just going to say, one thing too that I think is really extraordinary about this project, and that, the video that we put out, is also this summer, I was contacted by the great grandsons of the superintendent Heimbuckle, who wrote the reports and was there during the 1919 flu pandemic. And his great grandsons now, one was a professor, the other one, they both live in the California area, and they really didn't know anything about this story. And so we were able to connect. Not only are they serving as voices to bring this story to life in the exhibit, but their mother, who was the daughter of Heimbuckle, she didn't know anything about this either. And literally 2 weeks before she passed away from cancer in her 90s, we were able to share this story with her and tell her about what J.F. Heimbuckle did and the extraordinary measures that the Alaska Packers went through to save many of the children, especially at Sevenoski. And Sevenoski survivors are those cannery caretakers, and they are the residents of South Naknek today. So, again, to be able to bring these stories full circle in this context of 2020 is a really an extraordinary thing, and it speaks to really what the power of history can do.
Okay, there's a question from Tim Troll about the food and whether the Mexicans had to eat the Chinese food as part of the China gang, or did they have their own chefs, and if any of the APA records talk about the food supplies that were shipped north.
Well, the California labor reports do. When they were gathering evidence for their lawsuits, they interviewed former cannery people, and they interviewed not just Mexicans but also Puerto Ricans, and yeah, they complained a lot about the food. They did get some beans, which were more palatable to their diet, but they did not like the fact that they had to eat a lot of the Chinese contractor food supplies. And the other thing that they did not get enough on, especially as the ships going northward, was water. So that was the other thing, that they were just so dehydrated all the time too. So yeah, food actually is a big thing. And then as Anjuli points out, they also had to pay through the cannery store at these astronomical prices for any sort of luxury goods. And we have a lot of those supply lists that we're hoping to certainly interpret in the exhibit.
Yeah, but the APA records, at least for this early era, don't mention food at all because, yet again, that was something the labor contractor had to manage, and so it's not included in the corporate records. Later, in some of the union contracts, it mentions things about food, like you better have quality food for us. But there are these other sources like the California Bureau of Labor, and then I think, isn't it the 1890 census that Petroff includes a really robust listing of what was sent north for the Chinese canning crew from these Chinese from Chinese dry goods stores. And it's worth mentioning that some of these contractors, the names of which you saw in my presentation, they owned and operated dry goods stores themselves. That's it, looking at census records.
Mm-hmm.
That was their profession, was owning dry goods stores and grocery stores. So, I mean, they were making money left and right. They were able to, you know, they were pretty much providing the food from their own store, you know.
But you got a suit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we have one last question and then we'll be done. Just quickly, Ron Inouye asks, what was the global effect of canning technology on other fisheries and of the essential workers in those places and on the essential workers in those places?
Well, I think it's kind of, when you look at it from the perspective, at least the other way around, and Bob, you might be able to add to this too, is that the industry really starts with the fruit packing industry in California. That's where the technology, at least for canning, comes from. And the salmon cannery also, of course, comes out of California and then moves up into the Columbia and then ultimately up to Alaska. But
Right.
by 1916, they all kind of come together, the fruit packing companies and along with Alaska Packers, and it becomes Del Monte Corporation. So eventually they call it the California Packing Company until about the 1960s, but that's Del Monte, and that's a company that's going to change everything, how we eat and our relationship to food. And they were certainly selling that product to markets all around the world. So really what I've been kind of looking at is the connection with the fruit packing companies and those stories. And that also explains in many ways probably how Mexican workers were ending up going to Alaska, is because they were drawing on those essential workers in the farms from the Central Valley in California.
Yeah, Katie answered that well. There were lots of impacts as the technology did grow, as new machines and the like, and the sanitary can and everything else developed. But a lot of those were developed in the fruit and vegetable area and spread to the salmon industry and other fisheries. There were including tuna notably, but there were lots of connections between. You have Del Monte, Libby McNeil and Libby out of Chicago. They packed meat and vegetables and added fish to their menu. So a lot of it was integrated along the way.
It is interesting to think, that's a great question, Ron, and to think like what of the fisheries technologies and processing technologies actually originate or were innovated in Alaska. And I think that's a really interesting thing for us all to think about and talk about at another date.
That's perfect for another time. Okay. So we're going to wrap it up here, and I am going to I was going to share my screen. Why is it not allowing me to? Wait, I can try this again. Does not like this. I'm working on sharing something about Let's see. Oh, I see. Um, why is it not showing? You guys aren't seeing it, are you?
We're seeing it.
Are you since his cancer diagnosis?
Yeah, it's on my screen.
Okay, I can't tell that you see it, but okay. So I just wanted to let everybody know that, well, Terrence's family has let the historical community know, so passing it on, that since his diagnosis of cancer 3 years ago, Terrence has had to make a lot of difficult decisions relating to his health, and he recently made the decision to go into hospice care. The stomach cancer has made it hard for him to eat or drink, and he doesn't have a lot of energy, but he still has the same funny, warm, and exhaustingly inquisitive mind that makes him special. We had hoped he'd tune in yesterday or today, and that hasn't happened. So the family encourages anyone who wants to reach out to him to send him a letter or a note in the mail. And his niece said, bonus points if you drop in any Big Lebowski quotes. And she also adds, life is sometimes not as long as we want it to be, so it's important to say the things you mean when you have the time. So up on your screen, hopefully you see Terrence's address, which is 321 Hawk Road, Fairbanks, 99712. So in case anybody wants to communicate with him, that would be the best way. I just wanted to share that with everybody. So now it's Bill's turn. I have to let him come on. Okay, Bill, you have to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, go
You
for
should
it.
be able. I just want to say, Katie, that that picture of Terrence and his son typing brought back warm memories. I remember walking by his office and actually seeing Terrence and his son typing, and that kind of epitomized his love of history and his commitment to it. Well, it's my job to end this conference, and I want to thank everyone who contributed and all of you out there who tuned in and were willing to give Zoom its best shot. And I think it worked. And thanks to the program committee for making it work, and in particular, our pilot and co-pilot, Karen and Joe and Rachel, for organizing the conference, and everyone else who was involved. Some great presentations, and we're interested in your evaluations of how you think it went. So please share those with us. The conference was recorded and will be available, so stay tuned for that. So with that, we're off to a new year of great adventure for the Alaska Canneries Society.
Yes. So at 4:30, we're supposed to have the conversation with Gus and his.
Karen, that's my message.
Okay, then I guess we're done, unless anybody has anything else they would like to add. Time for a beverage to celebrate.
Mug up.
Mug up.
Good to see you all
Mug up to Bev.
here. Cheers. Cheers to that.
Yep. Thanks everybody for hanging in there with the Zoom issues. Really appreciate it.